But what we really need is a binding sort of, and it's complicated, but certainly doable, a binding system of arbitration linking the brands to a given factory, to a given supply chain situation, so that if workers go without pay, if workers go without benefits, if workers are simply fired and laid off without appropriate legal mechanisms in place or being followed through, and they're able to do that with impunity, that there are consequences not just for the factory, but the consequences for the group that is really controlling this dynamic, and that's the major multinational brand.
From Jakarta, welcome back to On the Level. I'm Jeff Hutton. In April 2013, the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Dhaka was thought of as sort of turning point in industrial relations in the textile industry. The accident killed more than 1,100 workers and injured thousands more, most of them women. Big brands had a come-to-Jesus moment, promising to yank their business from sweatshops and conduct better oversight over their contractors. David Welsh, the country director for the Solidarity Center, a nonprofit aligned with the U.S. labor group AFL-CIO, says not enough has changed. He argues for an overhaul of a system that essentially allows big brands to police themselves. He said COVID-19 has led to layoffs of millions across the sector as brands cut back on orders or even renege on payment to their contractors. H&M reported a 51% profit margin during the first 3 months of the year, even as COVID-19 was spreading through China, Europe, and the US. But first, our regular check-in on all things Indonesian with Kevin O'Rourke, author of the intelligence briefing Reformasi Weekly. Kevin, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Protests in the U.S. You're from where you're situated there in the wilds of Maine. I doubt if you're in the thick of it too much, but it's certainly shocked the world. I wonder, for a newish democracy like Indonesia, what kind of lessons could be drawn from an older democracy like the United States?
Right. Well, the dangers of demagoguery is one for sure, because we've seen a country regarded generally as having very deep, stable democratic institutions come right to the verge of chaos, as is the case now in the U.S. with dozens of cities around the country under curfews for days on end now. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, democracy has really been quite successful over the past 20 years, but the fact is the democratic history of Indonesia is far shorter than that of the US, and safeguards against demagoguery are problematic in any democracy, and that could be the case in Indonesia in the future. So that's one that just sort of jumps out, but I mean, there's a lot of others too. The countries have a lot of parallels and a lot of things in common, just in terms of their size and scope and diversity. So, Indonesia has a national police force, which is maybe an advantage when it comes to applying standards and protocols and safeguards and controls. And it's been a huge weakness in the U.S. With no standardized national police force. Those are a couple things that come to mind.
Yeah, in Indonesia, no stranger to violent protests, and with, shall we say, suspect policing. This is not a country known for strong institutions. I suppose it's hard not to be a little nervous about the prospects for a country like Indonesia if another big democracy like the United States is perennially getting itself into trouble. I'm thinking of the election of Donald Trump and now this. I'm a little nervous, and Brazil too.
Sure. Wherever there's democracy, there are typically opponents to democracy because there are special interest or venal interest or would-be authoritarian rulers who have a perceived self-interest in undermining democracy. And with the U.S., which properly or not has been seen as a beacon of democracy, struggling, that just plays into the hands of those who would oppose democracy in places like Indonesia. And that's a problem because Indonesia's democratic development has been decelerating, I would say, a little bit, or stumbling in recent years. President Joko Widodo has not really been actively deepening or strengthening Indonesia's democratic institutions, and there are ministers in his cabinet who are actually actively trying to curtail the scope of one of the real bedrocks of Indonesia's democratic process, which is the regional head elections.
Yes. It's coming up in December, I thought.
Yeah, that's the next round is due in 9 December 2020 now is the new schedule, but there are discussions underway to change the scope in future years so that only provincial governors are elected, not the heads of more than 500 district level regions.
They would be appointed?
Yes, that's right, and that would be a problem. Or elected by municipal assemblies or district assemblies, possibly. That's one of the points up for discussion. But it would be a shame, though, because right now the way those mechanisms work is that a talented, capable leader at the local level has a chance to emerge as the popularly elected district chief, and then if that person performs well, they can go on to become the elected governor, and then if they're, again, doing well, they can become a national figure. And that's exactly what Joko Widodo himself did, but now there's active discussion about curbing that, and that would basically sever that link of transmission to recruit talent into national politics, which is exactly what Indonesia needs.
How important are these district chiefs?
Well, they're pretty critical. Yeah, they have quite a lot of influence at the local level, and that is in a lot of cases the government that matters most to people. That's certainly been the case with the COVID-19 crisis unfolding. How district administrations handle testing and care and information has all been critical. And again, it's just a linkage that enables leaders to emerge from the grassroots into national politics, rather than having national politics dominated by a suffocating sort of entitled elite, which tends to pursue its own interests rather than serving the public.
I guess that might be rather the point, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Coming full circle there, yeah.
Stop that from happening.
Yeah, it's a classic conflict of interest between the majority and a self-serving tiny minority.
Well, from social cohesion to social distancing, COVID-19 has not gone away. Still very much with us in the United States and in Indonesia. We're taking steps towards reopening. Wondering what you think of that. President Widodo is talking about and taking a rather heavy hand toward enforcing distancing, mask wearing, for example, spacing out people, presumably in restaurants, while letting some non-essential businesses open. Is it too soon? What's your take on it?
Yeah, well, it's a tough one because basically increased activity and mobility will almost certainly lead to increased transmissions and therefore increased deaths. So it's certainly not a decision to be taken lightly. Knowing where to draw the line between deaths on one hand and economic activity and profits on the other hand is tricky under any circumstances. But the overall balance of indicators, which is mainly official data, but also a few other non-official indicators, show that the epidemic is actually maybe even already waning in Indonesia, at least on a plateau nationally. and certainly by no means anywhere near as severe as many of the worst hit countries in Europe and North and South America. So, with that under consideration, I think it is important now to move to a quote-unquote new normal with certain caveats. One being the health precautions, like you mentioned, that Widodo is emphasizing, but also the caveat that it may be necessary in future to restore some mobility restrictions, at least in certain regions, when detections of cases accelerate again, as is likely to happen. So there may be a need for a pulsating sort of rhythm to the imposition and the removal of social distancing and mobility restrictions at times in future. And I'm not sure the government is really preparing the public for that right now. Widodo has generally talked about this new normal framework as a permanent arrangement. And also he's been remiss at times about acknowledging that it needs to apply where appropriate and not as a blanket policy, because there definitely are maybe 4 or so provinces in the country where lifting restrictions is really not appropriate at the moment.
One of those provinces would be East Java, presumably. They're nearing 5,000 infections and not too far off Jakarta, which is where this whole saga began.
Yeah, what's interesting when I look at the official data, which I increasingly tend to trust, is that the epidemic clearly started in Jakarta, and then it came down a little bit while the momentum accelerated in West Java. Then Jakarta plateaued, and then West Java actually came down a little bit while East Java rose up very rapidly. Now what's happening is that Jakarta and West Java are on their own plateaus. In the past few days, East Java has started to slow down a little bit. There's still significant growth in cases there, but the rate of case growth is slowing down. The increase in cases, therefore, has been in smaller provinces around the country, and South Sumatra being the most significant in size, and then at similar speed but smaller size, South Kalimantan and North Sulawesi. So, but overall, as the national level, there's been a plateau now for about 10 days, and in fact, a slight a decrease of daily cases on a 7-day moving average basis. They were up near 700 as of 23 May, and now they're down to just above 600 a day. So, so that shows that the daily new cases nationally have actually been declining over the past almost 2 weeks now.
Yeah, and the capacity, the ability to find cases is improving almost daily too, isn't it? They're bringing online fancy new machines that can scan for tests a lot faster.
Yeah,
I think anyone listening to this outside of Indonesia would think that, well, it's just a disaster waiting to happen, given the scale, the vastness of the country, how many people are here, and the lack of resources. And they look at the numbers, 28,000 infections, and I think they're in the U.S. They're clocking that on a daily basis, and it's tough to have a lot of confidence in those infection numbers. Is it your sense that there is a darker story beneath the numbers, that there is an untold epidemic out there that we just don't know about it? We can't possibly know about it until we're able to test more. Or is there reason to believe that it's actually somehow in check?
Yeah, well, this has been a huge question, and the government has been remiss about publicizing its statistics that it collects about total deaths in the country. And so without that confirmed total death from all causes data, it's impossible to know for sure whether there are more people dying right now than there have been in the past. And why the government is not disclosing that is unclear, and therefore it just sort of fuels suspicion and skepticism. So about a month ago, I was really concerned about this. I was worried that the official data was really misleading and it was irrelevant. because testing was so low, and there was this questions about the deaths data. Now, however, I'm not nearly so worried. There was a very good randomized molecular test screening done in the municipality of Bekasi about 3 weeks ago, and that was the polymerase chain reaction PCR testing, and it was done on a random basis for 650 people.
That's the gold
in the
standard.
city. Yep, that's the good accurate type of testing. That's right. And they only found 4 cases there, so it showed that there was a very low incidence, well below 1% out of 650 people tested in that random screening. And then there's also a good proxy too.
Whoa, four cases out of 650.
Yeah, that's right. Those are active, sick people. So that was well below 1%. And this was in the second week of May. But yeah, that sort of jives with the official data and what the numbers kind of suggest, given the population of the country. Another proxy to look at is what they call the protocol burials, specifically for the province of Jakarta. And that's when someone dies and they hadn't been tested and they're not quite sure why the person died. They use special handling protocols for safety just in case. And that data has been collected. And that's been trending down consistently over the past month. Still significant, but trending downward. So mirroring, or I should say paralleling the official death data for the province, but at a higher level. So yeah, I think it's very possible that there are quite a lot more COVID-19 deaths in Indonesia than the reported number. But even if they were triple the official count, it still really pales in comparison to most of the countries in Europe, or certainly in the United States.
And that would be the case virtually everywhere, right? The official numbers are a fraction of the real. The real caseload is.
Yeah, other countries have this problem too. Yes.
Do you think in places like Indonesia get held to a different standard? They don't get a fair shake in the media. They seem to have an overly negative view. What's your view of how the media is covering this?
Right. Well, yeah, there's definitely a few problems on both fronts. The domestic media, what's really showing through is that very few Indonesian journalists handle mathematics very well, or use spreadsheets, or do things like calculating moving averages, or looking at trends and growth rates. So those are things that are really clearly beyond the bulk of the domestic media, because those types of ways of looking at the epidemic never arise. Instead, it's always typically just the aggregate numbers of cases reported, and that number is always increasing. And so there's this widespread perception, I think, that the epidemic is worsening in Indonesia among the domestic press readers, when in fact it's decelerating clearly. And then in the international media, there's always been this propensity to regard Indonesia with alarm, worry, or simply misunderstanding. And that was the case with the New York Times article. I subscribe to the New York Times and I love it, but there was one article last week that really just badly misrepresented the epidemic in the country. And it was really unfortunate because it complicates everything. Indonesia's struggling economically because of this, and they desperately need investment, and having those types of erroneous perceptions reinforced just hurts matters.
I think in that story that you're referring to, they were talking about an explosion of cases, and in a piece you wrote for your subscribers, for your clients, you cautioned the readers, saying that it's just because the authorities have improved their testing. They tested a pool of people who were suspected of having been positive for the virus.
Yeah, and the New York Times said that it was a random test, and it was not random.
Okay, well, hopefully you don't hold my reporting in suspicion.
No, now we need more reporters like you, Jeff.
There you go, and hey, my podcast, mate. All the best to you, Kevin. Thanks a lot for this. Stay safe.
Okay, yeah, sure thing. My pleasure. Thank you, Jeff.
That was Kevin O'Rourke of Reformasi Weekly. I've known my next guest, David Welsh, for a few years now. He's the country director of the labor outfit, Solidarity Center. Normally, our chats are an intense but brief encounter over coffee in a hotel lobby, shoehorned between his various other meetings. This time, we met over Zoom as he weathers COVID-19 at home in Canada. COVID-19 has thrown millions out of work across the textile industry. People are hurting all over, so how is this different? Most of those affected are women, and women tend to spend more of their pay packets on their families. They earn in a month what we might spend on a fancy dinner for two. Now, yes, it's true, big brands are hurting a bit. Nike said net income fell more than 20% during the 3 months to February to total just under $850 million US. That was still a profit margin of 44%. David joined me to argue, rather effectively, to say that big brands can probably afford to do more. David Welsh, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
David, I wondered if you could give us an overview of the scale and importance of the textile industry as it pertains to Southeast Asia. How important is it as an industry?
Well, it varies from country to country in terms of its specific importance to that sort of nascent industry, but it's hugely important. I would say, I mean, you have emerging markets in Africa, you have maquiladora sector and section in Central America and parts of South America, but South Asia and especially Southeast Asia really is where the bulk of the global garment industry is centered, and it varies in terms of its sort of per capita importance in a given country. So, for example, in Cambodia or Bangladesh, while they're on very different scales, the sort of percentage of their value for the economy in both those countries, it's 80% plus of the export GDP. And in Indonesia, it's something like just under 30% of the country's manufacturing economy. But Indonesia, while you're talking of thousands of factories and millions of workers, mostly centered in Java, doesn't sort of feature as prominently for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to talk about in either the consumer consciousness or in the media in terms of the attention it garners, but and in part because it's not the country's largest industry, but it's sizable. The one thing that one can say is that throughout Southeast Asia and in fact throughout the world, the hallmarks of the garment industry are present in each region, and namely that's what attracts the global garment industry. It tends to invest heavily in areas and jurisdictions where the rule of law is weakest and where there are sizable degrees, unfortunately, of poverty and a degree of impunity, and that seems to be where it really focuses its attention in those countries where it thrives in part because of that impunity and in many ways, what can be characterized as a race to the bottom in terms of trying to undercut markets' wages yet again and again, whether you're talking about Burma, Myanmar, Cambodia, Bangladesh, or Indonesia.
I think for any listeners out there who don't follow international development issues or international trade or indeed the textile sector, it only probably comes to mind when there are terrible accidents. We hear about the fires in the factories in Bangladesh, for example. Is it right to have a mental picture of an industry that has more or less moved out of China and into neighboring Asian countries like Bangladesh, like Cambodia? It's now more or less moved out of China, where it used to be. You used to hear about the sweatshops, and now settled more into Southeast Asia. Is that an accurate picture?
Well, no, in part, but I mean the size of the Chinese market, the presence of brands, in terms of the supply chains, in terms of raw material, is still very much centered in China. But in terms of the variety, numbers, and the diversity of where the actual global market industry is, all of those countries figure prominently, and frankly, the problems being faced by workers across the region in the regional garment sector stem from it's massive drop in consumer demand at the moment in the West, because all of this there are domestic markets, but the vast majority of these products are being shipped and exported to the U.S., the European Union primarily. But what really sort of kicked off what is currently a crisis was not initially the dramatic drop in consumer demand, but in fact how difficult it was to source raw materials, and many markets are still relying on China for that. And because this COVID-19 virus problems began causing market problems in China initially, that fled pretty quickly across the region and created a sort of domino effect. So, and I think it's fair to say every industry in the region in Southeast Asia is suffering. Certainly the workers are suffering tremendously at this point.
So the industry, the manufacturers are sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they can't get raw materials out of China, the resins and the various fabrics that they need. And even if they did get the raw materials, they wouldn't be able to ship out the shoes or the shirts to the Nikes and the H&Ms of the world.
The blame quite squarely at this point for what's happening, and we're talking about millions and millions and millions of workers who have been essentially left without, in many cases, without wages, without economic security, and without job security going forward, lies with the major brands. And those brands are Western, they're European and American. And you alluded to earlier tragedies. In 2013, I think the world's consciousness was piqued when the disaster of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh occurred, where thousands of workers died because of factory collapse. That garnered a lot of international attention, rightly so, a lot of consumer attention. But Bangladesh is not an anomaly. And what has been going on in terms of the struggle for worker rights, the struggle for trade union rights, the struggle for a living wage, definitely preceded Rana Plaza and continued after the fact. What's been shocking is, given the hammering that major brands experienced and their commitment to make some reforms in what is a diabolical supply chain post-2013, their initial reaction to COVID-19 and the fallout of that was, a polite version would be to say left a lot to be desired, but frankly was shameful. And what I'm referring to mainly is the initial commitment or lack of commitment by major brands to maintain orders, even to pay for orders that had already been processed and produced, cutting orders going forward, leaving factories. And I'm normally not particularly sympathetic to garment factory owners, but they have a bit of my sympathy at the current stage because they've really been left high and dry by many brands. And it was massive international pressure that got a number of major brands, and groups are tracking this, to at least commit to paying for orders that they are already placed, and in some cases committing to ongoing orders so that workers could be sustained. But the reality is that the margins are still the wages for workers throughout the region are still atrocious. No jurisdiction, no sector, no regional sector meets what we would qualify as a living wage for workers.
David, I just want to jump in there because I think for a lot of listeners that they may not be aware just how the industry is structured. So the Nikes, the Adidas, the H&Ms, the Gaps of the world, they don't actually make their own clothes. They don't have factories with a great big swoosh on them. They actually outsource this to other companies who specialize and maybe just specialize in making Nike shoes. There's a big one here in Indonesia, but it's a very long supply chain before it gets into a shopping mall, right?
There is, but it's also a very annoying sort of legal fiction, and this is what's being highlighted now, because if there was ever a period to highlight the legal fiction of the brands or sort of passive investors and don't control the market dynamics, it's now, because you're right in the sense that it's subcontracted, and very, very few brands, certainly in Southeast Asia, it's hard to see any brands that actually own factories. That's outsourced. But the brands themselves, on the one hand, the people who talk to me, the corporate social responsibility department, hem and haw about what can we possibly do to improve the lot of workers. But sourcing side of the brand, the one that makes the nuts and bolts financial decision, frankly, their job is to constantly cut costs, and those costs are cut far too often on the wage and benefit side of workers. And they do really control the dynamics of a given factory. They control the dynamics of what a worker earns. They control the dynamics of whether a factory that they source from has a union, promotes collective bargaining, promotes the rights of women, also an important dynamic in the regional garment sector, where by far the majority of workers are women, young women for the most part. But it allows this sort of, the way the industry is structured allows, if you're not well versed or if you're not experienced in the ways and means of it, allows brands to sort of say, look, we'd love to help the situation out, but we're just consumers ourselves in a way, which is not.
That's right. There are a couple bad apples. Sorry about that. We'll get someone else. But I take your point. I do understand that the brands have effective control over their suppliers. They can make a difference. But I think it's just important to paint a picture in the minds of listeners that these manufacturers, it is their incentive to reduce costs in order to maximize the payment coming from the brands themselves. And these brands have very, very large margins. I think H&M, even as COVID-19 was taking hold, was accelerating during the first quarter to the end of March, they have a profit margin of something like 50%.
The markups are amazing, and it's when people ask me, or consumer groups ask, which brand is best, which brand should be boycotted, conversations of that nature, it's really very complicated, because frankly, some are marginally better than others in this current crisis. Some have been forced to commit to maintaining orders to make sure that factories are at least able to pay workers back wages or wages currently, if not for too much longer if this dynamic continues. But the incentive of the brands, and there are many, many, many brands, but the brands like the ones you've mentioned, the major ones, say number 15 to 20. And so 15 to 20 brands really control the entire global industry. And it's in their interest, as long as no one, they can make a song and dance about their commitment to corporate social responsibility, their commitment to worker rights and a living wage, but for the most part, it's nonsense. And as long as no one gets out of line and does anything too dramatically good for workers, then no one else has to either. And that's the case in ad hoc factory cases as well. Right now, groups like our own and unions are dealing with a massive sector-wide dynamic where workers throughout the industry are suffering. But normally the dynamic is almost a case-by-case basis, where a factory in a given supply chain, whether it's a major European brand or a major American brand, gets out of line. It takes months, if not years, in some cases, to resolve the dispute, get back wages and justice for workers. You do that, but it rarely, if ever, sets a precedent that where the brand will then say, right, you've proven us wrong on this, we will make dramatic changes so that we don't have to repeat this throughout our supply chain. In fact, it's the opposite in almost every case, that they say, well, good, you chased us now for 9 months, 4 months, a year or so. You're going to have to do that on the next one as well, rather than making the structural changes that they know are necessary, right, and more importantly, that they know they can afford. And that's really the message now, where again, I've referred to it as a legal fiction. The brands are in a position to sustain the factories during this crisis. Their margins have been so excessive over the last 20 or 30 years in Southeast Asia that the major ones certainly can more than economize and sustain workers over this period. And the call is to contribute to funds, a global fund, or on an ad hoc basis with factories to make sure that wages are there and that workers are protected. Because again, the responsibility lies with managers and owners of a given factory. But as I said earlier, it's the brand that controls the major dynamics, and they're more than capable, certainly with the major brands, of stepping in dramatically.
What's happening in the factories, in the shoe factories, and the clothing factories? Are people out of work? Are there millions of people out of work?
It varies, but certainly there are millions of workers out of work. There has been, in some countries, a portion of factories, it'd be difficult to give exact numbers on what percentage, but the factories that have, on an emergency basis to sustain the factory and to sustain workers, have opted to temporarily produce PPE equipment, for example. Some factories are operating at 50% capacity, but that still means that 50% of workers have been let go, and in many cases let go without following legal guidelines. And I should say in Indonesia, for example, the government has issued pretty strict directives in terms of, if you are contemplating mass terminations that you can't afford to maintain workers, you have to absolutely establish, there's a high legal threshold to establish that it's absolutely necessary. And in those cases, brands can step in on an ad hoc basis, but they can do it more broadly as well throughout the sector. So there's no question that large percentages of a given workforce have been disenfranchised economically through this. And we're seeing it, in countries where, we've just approached, Ramadan has just ended. We've just approached Eid. The festive bonus is something workers rely on in places like Bangladesh and Indonesia, majority Muslim countries. Case after case after case of factories not even paying that bonus. So it's getting down to the nitty gritty. Then it's impacting workers in a dramatically bad way. And it's very short-term thinking, because while, garments are not a fixed commodity in the same way that oil and gas is, or palm oil is, it's going to be ongoing. And so when we get over this, the production line is going to have to be revved up. Consumerism will resume, presumably. People will have to wear clothes unless there's a global push towards sort of nudist practices, which is unlikely. So the industry will be sustained, and brands should recognize that what they do now is very, very important, not just ethically and morally, but in terms of their corporate image, that there'll be a long memory in terms of brands that stepped up and brands that didn't. And I'm not sure that's registering.
Well, I mean, I for one will be in the market for pants that don't have an elastic in the waist. So I will definitely be out there shopping after quarantine ends. But can we name and shame which brands are at least following the law, which brands are doing right by their employees, and which ones aren't?
Yeah, there is an extensive hit list is not a term I would use, but there's an extensive list. Groups like our colleagues in this, the Worker Rights Consortium, for example, has something called the COVID-19 tracker. If you go on their website, it's updated regularly, and you can see pretty clearly which major brands have committed to different levels of sustaining workers in factories over this period, and brands that haven't. And, this is not something that's terribly complicated. This is a pretty easy dynamic that brands have been the ones profiting enormously. By far the biggest winners in the global garment industry, race to the bottom of the last 30 years. And this is an historic moment where clearly the onus is on them to step up. Clearly the ability for them to do so is there. And it's amazing that many of them had to be encouraged from the get-go that they wouldn't be allowed to get away with simply canceling orders and abandoning workers in factories to pick it up whenever consumers decided they wanted to shop again or were able to shop again. So this is an ongoing struggle. But what it presents is highlighting issues that in a post-COVID world, the global and regional garment sector has to look carefully at. And that's whether you're talking about a living wage, wage security, bankruptcy protection so that workers' wages are protected, none of which occurs now really. But also, Jeff, I would say, it's absurd at this stage in 2020 to be relying on the goodwill of brands and things like corporate social responsibility and dialogue, all of which sound great, but none of them are binding. In a purely corporate context, you have international arbitration, you have a clear supply chain responsibility, a legal responsibility that doesn't operate in impunity, that there are consequences when you leave employees high and dry. That doesn't really exist in the global garment sector. There are ways to hurt countries by trade petitions. There are ways to embarrass companies by things like OECD complaints and corporate campaigns. But what we really need is a binding sort of, and it's complicated, but certainly doable, a binding system of arbitration linking the brands to a given factory, to a given supply chain situation, so that if workers go without pay, if workers go without benefits, if workers are simply fired and laid off without appropriate legal mechanisms in place or being followed through, and they're able to do that with impunity, that there are consequences not just for the factory, but the consequences for the group that is really controlling this dynamic, and that's the major multinational brand.
I'd like to take a moment to talk to the composition of the labor force here too. You alluded earlier in our discussion that they're mainly women. These are women that in Indonesia at least make roughly something like $380 US a month.
It varies from jurisdiction, and that's another point I could raise also. But anyway,
that's money that presumably will goes to the family. And if you lay off or make life difficult, withhold wages for these workers, they're primarily women, you're probably also going to be impacting entire families too, right?
Of course. And what we're seeing is as well, certainly the Indonesian government is doing what it can, and I lay the blame for what's happening again on the brands. I can't be more stark and clear about that. But what is happening as well is that when we're talking about these massive layoffs in a place like Indonesia, for example, there's a complicated wage setting mechanism, but it varies from area to area. So that while most of the garment industry is on Java, as you know, there are different pockets. And so what we're seeing is the big layoffs, the factories that are shipping production elsewhere are doing so and again, this race to the bottom is not just a global dynamic, it's a regional and even municipal dynamic in the sense that factories where the wages are higher, slightly higher by Western standards, but life and death margins, if you're an Indonesian garment worker, those massive layoffs are happening in areas in and outside Jakarta, for example, where the wage is slightly higher than different areas in Central and East Java. So that's another dynamic that's really, really troubling. And again, it's a question of how low do you have to go? I mean, the people talk about the huge wage discrepancy throughout the region, but it's comparing apples and oranges. What's at the heart of it is a living wage. If workers can't survive off their regular hours, if they need to do what amounts to essentially forced overtime just to survive, which is a dynamic throughout the region, throughout the sector, it's a huge problem. So the lack of economic security when the industry is doing well is a problem. What's happening now is diabolical, and it's no exaggeration to say millions of workers throughout the region are being left high and dry, and the blame for that lies squarely at the foot of multinational brands.
The ones who can least afford it are suffering the most.
Absolutely.
David, thank you for this. Do take care, yeah?
Okay, mate. We'll be in touch. Stay safe.
Bye now. You too.
Bye.
That was David Welsh of the Solidarity Center. And that's the program. Thanks to Kevin O'Rourke and David Welsh. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and rate us. It helps. Thanks to Stephen Handoko, our producer, Imam Shofwan for research, and Soundstripe for our music. I'm Jeff Hutton. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.